welcome. It's good to see so many people here today. Welcome to those who are watching online as well. I was looking on the Twitter feed, and I've seen that people are watching us from Poland, Russia, Ukraine, so I'm not nervous at all. So, let's have a look. Welcome to the session. It's called Small Talk, Making the Introvert's Voice Heard. There are two reasons I decided to do this talk today. First of all, it was about 2 years ago. I realized I was actually an introvert. Okay? Now, a lot of people hear that word and they think negatively. And what we're going to do today, we're going to look at what that actually means. Okay? And the second reason I did this was last year I taught a group. And in my first term I was teaching this group, I was pulling my hair out because out of a group of 12 students, 6 of them wouldn't talk to me. No matter what I tried, they wouldn't talk to me. So basically, with a little bit of research and a little bit of checking out a few facts, I discovered that 6 of these students were more like me. And through a few little changes, I managed to make the English language experience a bit more open and welcoming for them. And I want to share some of these ideas with you today. Okay? So, during this session, hopefully, you'll get to understand the different ways that introvert and extrovert students learn when they're in our classes. We'll also learn how all of us as teachers, and I do say all of us, we subconsciously promote an extrovert ideal in schools. And hopefully you'll take away some strategies that you can use to close the gap between introverts and extroverts and make the language learning experience a much more welcoming and open one for them. So, the first thing is the question, what actually is an introvert? I just want you to take a few seconds to think of two adjectives that you would use to describe somebody as introvert. People at home, I'd like to think about this as well. Have you got a couple of ideas in your head? I'm only going to ask one thing. Are they positive or negative? Neutral? Okay. Well, let's have a look. About a year ago, when I first started getting interested in this topic, I asked some teachers and some people who are not teachers to give me 3 adjectives to describe what they thought when they heard this person's an introvert. I gave them the phrase, that boy's an introvert. And here are some of the ideas. Bookish, shy, creative, oh sorry, we've jumped one, depressed, creative, quiet, weird, nerd, nervous, awkward, intellectual, sad, clever, lonely, and then my personal favorite, oh, the poor thing. Okay. Now, if we take a look at these adjectives, how many of these are actually positive? Not many of them. Okay, there is a tendency for people to think negatively about this. And it's basically something we as teachers, we need to address with our students in our class. Just very quickly, people in the audience here present, are any adjectives you would add to that list? Anyone want to shout anything out to me? No? You're all tired, you've had a long day now. Sorry. Reflective, that's a good one, yeah. Anyone else? I didn't hear that, sorry. You would say the creative as well? Yeah? Okay. So, let's move on. What actually is the introvert then? Let's have a look at a definition. I went to the dictionary, our favourite people at Cambridge Dictionaries. And they described an introvert as someone who's shy, quiet, and unable to make friends easily. Would you agree or disagree? Personally, I look at that and I totally disagree. Okay? First of all, the word shy. Shy has quite a lot of negative connotations, doesn't it? Okay? So then I decided to click on that word shy. It was on the online dictionary. Nervous and uncomfortable with other people. Not always. Okay? Not always. I then went for a proper psychological definition. I got really in-depth with all of this. Myers-Briggs. Anyone familiar with Myers-Briggs? There were 2 psychiatrists, who first were quite pioneering in the idea of the introvert and extrovert personality. And they described them as introverts expend energy through action They prefer to reflect, we've had the word reflective there, then act, and then reflect on their actions again. To rebuild their energy, they need quiet time alone. I can relate to that. I want to go home and be on my own. All right? So they also said they estimate that 35% to 45% of the population, I've written there it is introverted, but the actual phrasing was has introverted tendencies. Okay? Meaning that they may not be fully introverted, but they may have some part of their personality which leans towards that. Which is why we need to look at the misconceptions before we even begin. Now, the common misconceptions about introverts. When you think of an introvert, lots of people, not everybody, but lots of people may think things like they're always shy, as we mentioned before. They don't make good leaders or public speakers. I'm standing here. I don't know if I'm good or not, but I'm standing here. Don't like talking to new people. They hate being around other people and working in groups. Negative. They want to be left alone. Less intelligent but more creative. And don't enjoy fun and games. Can any teacher think of any student in their class who fits that profile? Because I can't think of a single student who fits that profile at all. And I certainly can't think of a student who doesn't enjoy fun and games. Okay, including adults, all right? So before we go on, I want you to decide, and the people who are watching online, I want you to think about this as well. I want you to think about your personality. Are you an introvert or an extrovert? Or a mixture of the two? I'm going to pose to you 8 questions. Don't panic. I'm not going to ask anybody to identify themselves. Okay? You don't have to give any answers. Just think. I want you to answer true or false to the following statements. Okay? I prefer to plan my ideas on paper before speaking. I don't like taking risks. I find multitasking difficult. People often describe me as softly spoken or calm. I often let phone calls go to voicemail rather than answer. I prefer hearing other people's opinions to expressing my own. For my birthday, I prefer small, intimate celebrations to big parties. And I don't enjoy small talk, but I like in-depth discussions about topics that interest me. Just think about those statements, true or false for each one for you. And it's very simple. According to this test, this is actually an official test for introverts and extroverts. Obviously, it's much longer and much more comprehensive. But the more you answer true, the more you tend towards being an introvert. Okay? If you answered false to all 8, congratulations, you're a complete extrovert. Okay? So moving on, what issues can these bring to children in our schools? Okay? Being an introvert in a school can be a tough thing. It can also be a really great thing. Okay? Let's not lie. It can have its positives and its negatives. But there's the idea of reacting to new people, new places, and new events. Let's imagine we're at the start of the school year. Some of us have already started. Some, like me, are starting classes next Monday. All these new students are going to walk into our classrooms. And if you've got an introverted student, they're going to walk in to a new environment with new students, a new teacher. That can be pretty stressful for somebody who needs, really needs to build their energy. They might find that they're unable to relate to their classmates, not because they're weird or a nerd, as we saw in the survey from before, but simply because they may have very different interests. Okay? Interests which no other student in the class may relate to, interests which the other students may tease them for. Okay? But so it makes them scared to express who they really are because they feel different. A fear of taking risks. We're all English language teachers in this room. Learning a language is a risk. You have to take risks. You have to speak out, give an answer when you're not completely sure. Yeah? So that's a huge pressure for them. Increased fear of ridicule, again relating back to what we were saying before about the hobbies as well. They make a mistake in class. They're terrified. They can be terrified of the reaction of the other students. So therefore, don't speak out. And then there's the fact that simply when a child feels emotionally threatened, there's a block on learning. They don't learn anymore. It can completely stop the learning process. So what we need to do is make the classroom a welcome environment for introverts and extroverts. Okay? And in our schools, as they are in schools, in language centres like the British Council or language academies, we subconsciously, we focus on the extrovert. We promote the extrovert ideal. How do we do that? Well, first of all, school's not a natural environment. I may get chastised for saying that, but school is a completely unnatural environment. How many of us have to go to a room for 6 or 7 hours of a day with 29 people and look to the front? We don't have to do it. We don't have to be talked at by teachers. It's not a natural environment. And also I'm going to quote Terry Deary. Is anyone familiar with Terry Deary? Or these books? Horrible Histories. Being a proud Scot, I had to choose Horrible Histories of Scotland, of course. But Terry Deary, who's a very famous children's author, has a lot of opinions about school. He actually calls them pits of misery and ignorance. I don't know if I agree with that. But he said what he did question in an interview with The Guardian about 10 years ago was, who decided that putting 30 kids and one teacher in the room was the best way of educating? Which is basically, how can one person control all these different personalities? This is the way I read into in this context. How can one person control all of these personalities in one room? And then we actually have the school and the school day, the curriculum, everything is structured towards the extrovert. We have teacher attitude. Our expectations that we place on our students, especially as language teachers. We expect our students to come into a room and talk to us in English. We expect our students to come in and sit in nice groups of 6 people and have an in-depth discussion about, I don't know, something that they may not relate to at all. But we have this expectation over them. Our classroom layout, something that we don't think about, but we may actually be preventing introverted students from integrating into the classroom simply through the way we have organized the room. We'll look a bit more into this. The curriculum can close out certain groups of students in terms of their character, their personality. And in our non-class time, perhaps those of us who work in language centres, dedicated language centres, don't have to deal with this so much, but state school teachers or private school teachers, you will have to deal with non-class time, which can be a very, very stressful experience for an introverted student. And then our actual simple classroom activities, our day-to-day classroom activities. So what we're going to do just in the second part of this talk is look at these areas individually. Look at what the traditional problems have been and how, well, I'm going to suggest some ways I have adapted, and hopefully they can work for you in your classrooms. Okay? So the first thing I'm going to look at is a teacher attitude. Now, I want you to think of a very specific occasion. I want you to think of the end of term, the end of the year, when you're writing the reports for your students to take home to their parents. And thinking about the comments that you write on their reports. Are you always nice? Most of the time, I think. Even when we're being negative, we try to be positive, don't we? I'm going to pull out the good stuff now. I got some quotes from my reports when I was at school. And you're all thinking, oh yeah, here comes the good stuff now. I'm going to read you a few of these comments, okay? And I apologize to my ex-teachers if they're watching, but it's your fault. Mr. Sankey, 1996. Alastair lacks application. He's not really interested. He lacks confidence. He hides to avoid tasks. I don't remember ever hiding behind a desk. Okay? He's capable of better. Mrs. Torrens, 1989. Yes, I'm that old. Could work better, lacks application. Oh, thank you. I like the reaction. Mrs. McElhinney, 1992. He has the potential to achieve more. Mrs. Miller, 1996. He can do well when he participates. There are times when he just doesn't want to work. Probably a Friday morning, but But other times. And finally, the one that always stuck with me. This one I didn't even need to look at the report card to remember. This one has always stuck with me. My English teacher, I'll let this man remain anonymous. Alastair often appears inattentive or lazy in class. And the reason that last one strikes a chord with me is because I'll explain the class. I actually loved Mr. X's class. I nearly said the name. I actually loved that class. But that man made us have big discussions every day when we went into the room. And he made us have discussions about these really bizarre topics. A, I had no interest, and B, I really couldn't think what to say. So I just used to sit at the back of the room, which was my allocated chair. I didn't choose to sit there. And just watch and listen. And the teacher interpreted that as being lazy and being inattentive. Okay? So this is what one of our traditional attitudes has been. As I say, traditionally, we are changing these things. Encourage group learning and peer interaction. We push students into these situations. I'm sure all of you have had a situation where you've had a report from a teacher when you've been at school and it said, doesn't work well in groups, or needs to participate more, or perhaps lazy and inattentive, like Mr. X said to me. We've all had some sort of comment like that at some point. As teachers, we worry about lonely students. And you see I put lonely in inverted commas there. Perhaps they're not lonely, but it's our tendency that we see a student on their own and we go, oh, why? And we want to help that student. And then in general, we're all guilty of pushing students into potentially stressful situations without realizing it. I don't mean we're deliberately going, pushing students there, but without thinking about it, we can cause that stress. What can we do? I found one of the best things I changed in my class last year when I refer back to that particular group I was talking about at the start of the talk. When it came to pair work, I always said, unless it was absolutely necessary that they worked in a group, you can work in pairs, or if you prefer to do it on your own, you can feel free. 90% of the class worked in pairs. 10% went off and did it on their own. But everyone in the class felt comfortable doing the work as they wanted to do it. I found this particularly worked well with older teenagers and adults, once I branched it out into other groups. But just letting them have that option of how they want to work gave them a bit of a freedom. It took away a bit of that ridicule. Oh, the teacher said it's okay to work on our own. Great. Okay? Some people just like doing that. Never automatically assume that a student is lonely. Assess the situation properly. I want to come back and talk about this a little later on when we talk about non-class time. But we can't just automatically assume that a student on his own or his or her own is lonely, because it may not be like that. But we should speak to students about their preferences. And again, I'll mention later on it's connected to another part later on, but I think, and it's something I'm going to adapt this year after my research last year, is basically early in the term, integrate into the class some form, be it the true or false quiz that we've just done, but something to discover who are the students who have more tendency to be introverted, who may need that little bit of extra freedom to work on their own, or who need that little bit of support when working in a group. But we need to speak to them and not just make assumptions. I want to move on now and just think about classroom layout. Now, before I talk about this section, I understand that some teachers may not have the freedom to adapt their classroom, especially those who are in state schools sharing classrooms with other teachers. I've got the luxury that I have my own classroom that I can use. But I want you just to have a quick look at that. Does your classroom look familiar to any of those? I'm imagining that those who are working in high schools, primary schools, you're probably something similar to this, either in pairs or individually. Those who are in primary schools, maybe something more akin to this. Yeah? And those who are in language schools, maybe some sort of variation of this. Yeah? Imagine, I was asked a very good question when I was interviewed earlier on about this talk. A 14-year-old introvert come into your classroom. They may feel stressed simply by the layout. Where do I sit? What can I do? An introverted student isn't going to want to sit here, for example, because they're in the center of all the attention. An introverted student may look at this and think, oh my God, where can I sit so the teacher doesn't ask me? Yeah? So the classroom layout could be a contributing factor. Again, I repeat, it's something that you may not have control over. But I've experimented over the course of the year, as I said, with the luxury of having my own classroom. I've experimented with a couple of different layouts, which have been quite positive. And the most common of that has been this first one. That is the traditional layout of my room when I walk into it at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. Okay, here in Somos Aguas, when we share with the day school, that's how my classroom looks. And a very simple thing I did last year was some separate desks at the back of the room. And you're probably thinking why it looks like a punishment. But there were 2 students who particularly liked those desks. They sat, oh, I've lost my button. They actually sat in this desk here during parts of the class. But if I asked the class to move around and make pairs, or if they wanted to work on their own, often they would go to these desks here. Just simply because they had that little bit of flexibility that they could. Obviously at first, yes, they felt shameful about it, I'm not going to lie. But as time went on, they actually realized that there's no shame in going off and working on your own. Another possibility, and this is something that I've only tried once, I'll be honest, and this is actually my plan for term 1 this year. Look at the layout of the classroom there. There's nothing in the middle. My classes have a maximum of 15 students. Some of you are probably thinking, you are so lucky. Okay, but I'm lucky that I have the maximum of 15 students. Okay, and my idea is we have the working space, but this area here, for the group discussions. It's completely separating the group discussion from the work and giving the students that time to clear and have distinctive areas could, I believe, help introverts have that time to recharge. They have their time with the group discussion, but then can go away. It could also have the addition of those famous individual desks, which is my plan for this year. Another one, this is more suitable for primary school, and I've seen this work in primary schools, is your traditional class layout, either in groups or in rows, as some classes are. But with this wonderful area in the corner. It could be a reading corner. It could simply just be a few chairs without desks, where if the students are doing an activity that they can manage without a desk, if it's something reading, for example, they can move away to a quieter area to recharge. The only problem being it could result in a fight for the limited number of chairs, especially if there's sofas, as I saw in one classroom. Okay, I would fight too. And then finally, this is a particular favorite of mine. And I'm going to refer back to this classroom layout just in a few moments in another section. Those individual desks. But at the back of the room, there's another teacher's desk. And the reason there was another teacher's desk is 9 times out of 10, the teacher's sitting here and the students are looking at you, yeah? While the students are doing an activity, when I've done the classroom, when I've set up my classroom like this, I move away while they're working on an activity and I set up a little camp at the back of the room. And that means that it's simply the eyes are not on them. They can pick up their work and they can come to me to get it checked and they can go away without 30 pairs of eyes on them. I also give them the flexibility that they don't have to complete the work before they bring it to me. If they feel comfortable doing 5, let's imagine it's a first certificate activity, a use of English. If they feel comfortable doing 5 questions and then getting it checked, bring it. If they prefer to complete everything, let them bring it. But I set up my little camp at the back of the room until the time for the activity is finished. And they can come and go in a relaxed manner. And it is just simply that, diverting attention away. Okay. Just moving on very quickly into curriculum. I don't want to spend too much time talking about curriculum because we all work in different sectors. We all work to different curriculum. But just a few things that curriculum do have in common is little flexibility in working practices. When I say working practices, I mean they're geared towards pushing students to work in groups. They want students to collaborate. They want students to be participative, which is fantastic. There are skills they can use in the workplace. However, it could be stressful to have that for 6 hours a day. You know, we need to have that variation. Another thing that infuriates me is that in some sectors, participation is still considered part of the final result. I could have 2 students in front of me, one who's completely extrovert and one who's completely introvert. And that introverted student could lose points simply for participation. I'm thankful that I don't have to grade my students in that way. But there are some students who are graded simply because of their participation. They feel obliged to get into a stressful situation simply to get that extra 2 points or whatever it is. But there are still that part. And those reports I was referring to when I was at school, they all had that little box, participation. And then just some of you who may have been in Bernie's talk just in the last session or watching online, she was talking about summative and formative assessment. An emphasis on summative assessment for an introverted student can also be an extremely, extremely stressful experience because it all depends on how they perform on one day rather than gradual build-up or just simply seeing them how they are. What can we do? I mentioned before, give the students the choice in how they're going to participate in some activities. Give them the chance to work in groups. Give them the chance to work in pairs individually if it's feasible in your classroom. Focus their results on their progress. Forget their participation. If you're worried about their participation, speak to their parents directly, but please don't take results from them. Okay, please don't take their scores down because of it. And use a system of formative assessment. I find working with formative assessment is much better because as Bernadette was talking about in the last section, you could just walk around the room, lean over a child's shoulder and have an idea of how they're working. Just listen to them when they're speaking to a partner. It's not a stressful experience for them. It's just simply a classroom practice that they are adapted to and they're accustomed to. But with non-class time for an introvert or an extrovert can be a completely different experience. Again, we move back to what I was saying before about you look out, as if you're a teacher and you're out in the playground during break time and you see a student on their own, what do we think? Oh my God, why? We worry about that student. We want to integrate that student. When students are young, we push them to forge friendships. I don't know if I have any teachers from nursery, kindergarten classes in today, but we do have a tendency to push them to forge friendships, which has its benefit, but can also be a negative thing for them, which I've just jumped ahead and say, but we force them to go into these situations. But perhaps they need this time to recharge. One of the key things, thinking back to what Myers-Briggs said about introverts, is that they need time to reflect after an action. If a student has had an hour in a discussion, in a speaking class, and then they have a break, perhaps they need those 10 minutes just to be on their own, recharge the batteries, and get ready for the next attack, as it were. Perhaps going out and having to socialize when they don't really want to is just going to make things worse for them. What can we do? Well, the first thing I find works for me is allowing the students to enter the class upon arrival and no queuing outside. Obviously, you have to be there for this, or you may have destruction, total destruction in your classroom. But letting them in can give them, introverted students who may arrive early for class, give them those extra 2 or 3 minutes to get ready, get into the mold, and get recharged, ready for the session. If you've got a break, give them a safe and quiet space where they can reflect. Give them just time that they can be quiet on their own, or perhaps with some of their friends who they're not forging friendships, true friendships. They can just sit and relax. I teach an intensive course once a week here, which is a 3-hour with a break. And I try to do that for these students. I try to stay in my room. And if they want to stay, they can stay in for the 10-minute, 15-minute break. 1 or 2 of them do. The majority want to go away as far from me as possible, which I can understand. But there are 1 or 2 who take advantage, and one of them particularly just likes to sit and read. But if that makes that student feel better for the next hour of the session, I'm willing to give up those 15 minutes. And then finally, it's that key thing about speaking to a student to find out if they are truly separated from a group. They might not be truly separated. It could be that it's just they want to be on their own. Okay, I'm conscious of time. I know that some of you want to go and see the plenary, so this is just the last section we'll move through quite quickly, but I do think it's the most important, is the actual way we structure our classroom activities. As I mentioned earlier, I think one of the things I'm going to do this year, after seeing the results from using a tool like this last year, is incorporating a personality quiz similar to what we did earlier on. Using it early in the year, it can be quite a fun thing to do in class. I tried it with an adult class in January of this year, and it was supposed to be a 15-minute activity. An hour and 20 minutes later, we had done no work, because they had just had so much fun with it. They discussed their answers, and then we got on to talking about the whole idea of introversion and extroversion. It really brought it out. And the adults were identifying what kind of learner they actually were. It works with teens as well. You can get them to really take it seriously. The idea of a class menu. Don't surprise your students. Don't surprise introverted students. Let them know what's going to happen. When I say a class menu, I don't mean, yes, we're going to have steak. I wish. But what I'm going to say, right, today we're going to do a discussion on, I can't think of a topic, but anything. Then we're going to write a short paragraph to summarize what we've discussed. That introverted student can relax because they know what's coming. There's no surprises going to be sprung on them. They know that during the discussion, what the information they use is going to be brought back in the second part of the lesson. It gives them a structure in their mind. When you're asking questions to your students, when you're doing a question-answer session and you're at the front of the room, don't just take the first hand that goes up, because probably the first hand that goes up is an extroverted student. Yeah, you have to give your attention to them as well. But the best way I've found so far to do this is use a question, pause, question, answer approach. Ask the question, give it a second so that people can calculate what you're saying. Repeat the question, then invite. Because as we said earlier, in the quiz, I was talking about you like to plan your answer before you speak. It gives the introverted student that extra few seconds, right? Okay? Give them that extra few seconds just to think. Now, this is a controversy. A few people have taken me on this particular one. I introduced a pass option in my class. Some teachers have said to me that they don't think it would work for them, and that especially teenagers would take advantage of it. But if you train them right, it's like having a puppy. You can get them to do anything you want. Okay? Simply, they will take advantage at first. But if you work with them, give them the opportunity. If they don't know the answer, the words "I don't know" can do more damage than pass. If you watch a game show on TV, what do they say? I don't know. No, they say pass. Okay? Give the students the chance to pass. And once you get that up and running in your class, it takes away the embarrassment. If you pick on an introverted student for a direct answer and they panic because they haven't had time to think, pass. Right? Move on. Okay? It's just, it's open to abuse. I recognize that. You really have to train students to use it. But it is a fantastic tool once you get it up and running. As I mentioned before, letting students choose whether they work in pairs or alone. But more importantly, in some of your activities in the class, stay away from them. As teachers, we have the tendency to walk around the room and go, oh, I don't like that answer. Or, oh, you might want to think about that. No, stay away from them. And that's why I like the idea of having the teacher camp at the back of the room. Because it means I stay away from my students and I let them have the freedom to think. I let them have their time. Okay? Which leads on to that point about the correction point away from your normal desk at the back of the room, for example. And incorporate some quiet time into your class. If you've got a big discussion going on, follow it up with something where they're working on their own. Give those introverted students a chance to recharge their batteries and focus their ideas on something. It's something I think we tend to forget. We just go from one high-level activity to another high-level activity. But quiet time can actually be beneficial, and not just for the teacher. And then if you are working in groups, give each student a clear role. An introverted student might enjoy, for example, they may not feel confident enough to participate so much in a discussion, but they may be particularly strong in taking notes about what the group's discussed and then using those notes to feed back to the class. Because simply having those ideas planned on a piece of paper gives them the confidence to participate. They may not have done it in the first stage, but they're definitely part of the class in the second stage. Or another one I particularly like, I can't remember who I took the idea from, but it was a fantastic idea. I appreciate whoever gave me it. The language police. If you've got a particularly quiet student in a group, assign them the role of the language police. They have the sole responsibility of making sure the rest of their group are speaking in English. You'd be surprised how well it works. And how suddenly a very quiet student takes on the role of a policeman and abuses their classmates because they're speaking in their mother tongue. But it gives them a purpose in the task. And all that time they're listening and they're participating in a different way. Similar to the class menu, if something unusual is coming up in the class, give them a pre-warning. Don't give them a surprise exam, because that's one of the most stressful things I've found that you can do to an introverted student. Giving them a surprise exam, they haven't had time to think about it, they haven't had time to get the information moving in their head. Give them warning. If you're going to give them an exam on Wednesday, tell them on Monday or Tuesday. Don't tell them on Wednesday. Okay, give them pre-warning. And similarly, if there's a new situation or new people, expose them gradually, especially important with younger students. If they're coming into a new school environment, it can all be totally, totally overwhelming. And when they take a risk, show them that you admire their effort, because it's the only way that you'll get them to take a risk again. Thank them for their contribution publicly, or make a good comment about their contribution. Don't overdo it, don't embarrass the poor thing, but recognize the fact that they've taken that risk. And finally, I'm just going to finish up with a very quick story that I heard recently, and I thought it connected quite well to what we're talking about. It's a story from Mark Twain. I'm sure you're all familiar with Mark Twain. Some of you may actually already know the story about the great general. No? I'll tell you the story anyway. There was a man who he died and went to heaven. As he came up to the gates of heaven and he met St. Peter, he looked at him and went, "Oh, you're quite an intelligent man." He said, "I've always been interested in the military, and I would love to meet the greatest general who ever lived." And St. Peter said, "Well, he's right over there." And he pointed to a man. And the man who had just arrived at heaven said, No, you've made a mistake. That man, I knew him when he was on earth, and he was nothing more than a common laborer. And St. Peter replied, "Yes, but if he had been given the chance to be a general, he would have been the greatest general that ever lived." And I think that connects quite well with the idea of introverts and extroverts. We have to give the introvert the chance, and they could be as strong, if not stronger than, any other person in the class. We don't want to overlook them. We don't want to lose them. Similarly, we don't want to lose the extroverts. I've got nothing more to say. I hope these techniques have been useful for you and you can incorporate some of them into your class. My objective today was to raise your awareness on the idea, because it is something, as I said, we can easily overlook as teachers. So please take all these ideas, incorporate as many of them as you can into your class. Give those generals the chance to shine. Thank you. Just if anybody else has any questions or comments after the session, I know for those who are online as well, we're moving very quickly on to the final plenary. But if anyone wishes to contact me regarding this, you have my email address there. Okay, thank you.